Well, they weren't serious about this light. Good to see you all out there, and thanks for coming out. And thank you for taking the time out of your life and spending your money, your hard-earned money, to come and learn about this issue. As Dr. Dream said, I was a traditional guy. I had a very traditional background, and there wasn't much getting around that. What I have to do is say thank yous first. Number one to Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden, who through his website introduced me to the potential of energies and directed energy weapons in weather manipulation, amongst their other many, many potentials. Clifford Carnicom, who was one of the guys that I could go to and look at data, that yes, there is someone else out there dealing and looking at this chemtrail issue. The late Ken Stedman, who after I came out and did my first essay on chemtrails and the possibility of weather modification with Dr. George Ure, who was a former news director with urbansurvival.com, kind of brought me into the forefront of this issue, because to my knowing at the time, there hadn't been another weatherman out there talking about weather modification, and of course the slew of other early chemtrail researchers who had information, but I wasn't yet comfortable with, simply because the understanding of meteorology didn't meet my satisfaction. And then of course my partner Don Gifford and his support of me, and honestly through our company Blue Water Alchemy, financing my cameras and time lapse and computers and so forth. All right, this is kind of what I see daily. I'm going to step back, and I've got a couple of 2-minute videos that we're going to go through, because there's some weird stuff going in the sky. And what I'm wrestling with is, how far back does this go? How far back? Because there are pictures in old books, more than a century old, that demonstrate some of these things that I consider anomalies. So how old is this technology? All right, Celia, let's roll this. And what I'm doing is I'm just shooting with my little camera. And I'm in Crestone, and I'm just out there watching the planes. Look at those ripples.
Plane up in there. And like what we're seeing through most of today is very few are leaving trails. Very few. Somebody just spot him in this viewfinder. There he is.
No trails. No
So they're
trails.
low and slow. They're still, as Wilhelm Reich and James Trevor Constable do, they're up there cutting the ether. They're stirring the pot. Look at these waves. Come on now. Is this country really full of stupid weathermen? I mean, stupid. Or are they just gutless and without the courage to talk about these things? I really have to wonder which it is. Are they stupid, or are they without courage? It's one or the other, because there's really no other choice.
Is that where it's coming from?
It's headed that way.
Did it made all that noise?
Oh no, that's a little jet.
Or is that a different one?
It's a different one. Maybe not.
It's pretty noisy. Oh, I heard the jet. There's something else.
I've never seen this kind of plane.
You know, that almost looked like a prop job.
Like a what?
A prop plane. It really did. And I haven't seen one of those leave a trail like this, except for a C-130, ever.
Like a turboprop?
Uh-huh.
And that was the plane. That was the type of plane.
All right, something I've never seen before was a smaller 2-engine prop job leaving a chemtrail. And this is its trail, going from the southwest up and overhead. So obviously it's a trail because of its persistent nature. And then of course we've got a break there where there's kind of certainly a spot that they're interested in. But I've never seen two-engine prop job that sounded like a commuter plane doing one of these. In fact, the plane had a canard on the front with a blue tail, the tail painted blue. But I've never, ever seen them chemtrailing, so they're opening up into a different kind of aircraft type to pull off these operations. And then there's something going on up, it's back out here. Something else going on with the clouds here that he was probably keenly interested in. There you go, now we finally found focus mostly. This camera likes to drift focus. I wish some manufacturer would institute an infinity focus for their movie functions. That would be highly welcome. Highly, highly welcome. But here's this persistent trail, and I'll have to pull out a still frame from that movie of him so we can throw this up on the web. But there's the mark. There's the break in the tail, where we have a different energy pattern here in this part of the sky versus here, and then we've got something happening here. Nevertheless, chemtrail from a non-jet and non-jet aircraft. And I've seen C-130s do it before, but this was new. This was new. Something else to be on the lookout for. Hang in there, guys.
So I've kind of grown accustomed to seeing these jets, the 747, 737, 767s, all of those kind of planes. This was a new plane. So that's something else we're going to have to begin to look out for, is if they're looking at a less expensive aircraft. Well, the mic will come back up. There we go. There we go. We're going to do this a couple of times. There's a couple of videos to play with. So there we go, without the echo, right? We had a music festival in Crestone about 2 weeks ago. I believe this was the 5th of August. And this is how I kind of came to understanding what the trails were doing, is that we had Laura Eisenhower talk about these sylphs in the sky, these elemental energies, these beautiful, sometimes angelic-looking things, but there's an unusual geometry that is just too odd to be, moisture being strung out in the atmosphere. There's too much structure there. There's just too much structure. And what I have discovered is that these chemtrail planes, and there's the laser, right there at the beginning, because there's this formation here, and then on the other side of this, as we eventually roll the video and come out, we'll see this pattern here on this side. But right at the axis, right at the center, the spray begins. All right, go ahead and roll this, guys.
Let's see. Let's see if he starts laying out a trail.
Here, and the plane is there, right
Yep,
at the center.
there he goes.
Oh yeah, I see it.
See it? Yeah, there's all kinds of colors with this one.
I didn't know until I was in my 20s. When you do this, you go down what's that?
Look at him go.
That's an Allegiant Air airline, an MD-90.
Well, maybe you should have told me.
Wow. And it's off.
Look at all those colors. You're not going to get that with a pure condensation trail. There's those metallics in there. And number one, he's too low. He's too low. He's not at a cruise altitude. I'm too far away from Denver. Or Fort Collins, where that plane would come in and out of in Colorado.
Oh, beginning there. Yeah. It's a little
bit later.
from there, back it over. I'm gonna back up. There he is.
Oh yeah, I see it.
And see
Yeah.
This spot.
all these.
They said yes. So
This
wow,
spot.
that's interesting. And then I heard other people
And
say,
that gap.
you know, I don't have to filter this through a super objective, subjective test. If people tell me they like a band and they say they're unusual.
All right, go to the next slide. So what I had come to understand is that we're using these trails as a means of surveillance of energies that are going on in the atmosphere. And this first picture here off to the side, because there are two primary aspects to this geoengineering program. This was an all blue sky day, January in the San Luis Valley. This was the sole cloud in the sky. There was nothing else. But that cloud formed, and out of, well, nowhere, this trail decided that it was a good idea to bisect it. So whoever the weather makers are, they were aware of this. And so the trails are out there as a means of surveillance of energies that are happening in the atmosphere. This is supposed to be the closed low or the center of an extratropical cyclone. That's what they teach us in meteorology. And in meteorology, one of the classes you must take is fluid dynamics. Fluid. And so what I had learned to see is that we have not curves. We don't have bends and gentle spirals, but the weather has been bound into resonant shapes that are now squares. And they use these holes to literally swing the whole storm around these anchor marks. The cold front would arc out, the warm front would come off to the side, but still in the calm ahead, you will find these cubes. And within these cubes would be the typical low pressure center. And we'll see these at hurricanes in the future. This is an energy that some people are not happy with us talking about. That's right here. All right, we're dealing with what I like to term, or Wilhelm Reich termed, is the Orgon energy. It's the chi, the prana, the life force, the Sophia, as Laura talked about. It is ubiquitous, it fills all space, it is mass-free, cosmic, primordial. It is from the source. It spontaneously pulsates, expands, contracts, and flows with a spinning wave characteristic. Now, when I went to look at time-lapse imagery of cumulus clouds, they don't bubble, as we're taught in thermodynamics. They don't bubble. It's not one partial lifting and then condensing. Everything has a spin. Everything is turning. It is negatively entropic, which means that once it begins to collect, more comes to it. It's not positively entropic like a radiator where the heat radiates off. Once a little begins, it begins to attract. It accumulates the energy. And it has a mutual and very strong affinity to water. Water is key. It is excitability via secondary energies, nuclear, electromagnetisms, sparking, electrical sparking, friction, and it does penetrate all matter, although it happens at different. So what I kind of learned, and this was a conclusion that I didn't come to lightly, is that the weather has become a program. There is the natural force. There is this thirst that the planet has when the land is dry. It wants to rain, it wants to keep itself in balance, but there has been this electromagnetic girdle, if you will, that has been draped across this planet, and it is in the form of waves. You can see these waves, they are profound, but what is curious is that then there's waves arcing across at precisely 90 degrees. How many of you, by a raise of hands, have seen contrails intersect at perpendicular angles, 90 degrees? I mean, all of us who have looked have seen that. That is a very, if not the most common orientation, geometric orientation of those trails, is straight up 90 degrees. This is another one, and it's about another two-minute video. We'll roll this. But what is happening here is we're beginning to see some lenticulars forming over the mountains. And before the lenticulars form, the plains arrive. The plains come first, the chemtrails are laid out, the geometry is established that then allows the clouds to form. These trails are used as markers, as guides, as like this laser, we're going to point at something and the energy is pulsed along them. If you're going to introduce a pattern or an energy into the atmosphere, it has to be precise. Let's go ahead and roll this, Celia.
We're getting some clouds forming. A few chemtrails, not lots, but You know, where they're working, they're working. This one just came along, left a nice mark. It's obviously a bend, but right there. And then this one along the bottom came along and marked that southern or that easternmost extent of this first persistent trail, but there's a profound bending here. And this often happens before the lenticulars show up. So we're going to watch this closely. As you can see the gridding that's taking place right in through here as we see these curtains of powder puffs begin to bend back away. And then the other trail below will intersect another trail here, and it has two bends in it, 2 points. And so we'll watch to see where this plane here intersects it. And then I'm going to have to put the time-lapse camera up on these mountains because I'm seeing more planes here. There's more planes. So something's about to happen along these mountains. So I wonder if the plane is going to go right into, well, let's right it through here where this push, where this bend to the north is. Because they really like to use the trails to align the geometry, the waves. The trails are like sighting mechanisms. So everybody can sight these waves along certain channels in the atmosphere. So there he goes across. And the bulk of his trail is still fluorescing, it's still glowing. And then this guy, look at that. Yep. And another one coming up along the side. So I'm going to put the time-lapse camera up here and see what happens. Here's the lenticulars that might start to form, and you can certainly see that there's trails that have been interested in them. See if this continues to develop for the rest of the day. They're aware, very keenly aware of those lenticulars. So what's going on here? A couple of flights kind of all converging on this spot. You can see that there's some patterning that's showing up in here. That trail is that these trails are all interested in. And even up in the sun, there's more patterning. Nevertheless, we've got pink and blue trails going on here. Busy day in southern Colorado. Powders. You just hang in the sky. Just hang in the sky. Humidity's way too low for these trails to be persisting, but yet there they are. So it tells us straight up, it ain't condensation. Look at this blue sky. Blue all around. All around.
So that's kind of what I'm seeing. And it's tough for me to go outside without a camera. It's just, I think I've been through 11 cameras in 11 years. It's just, they're field cameras, and I use them, and I kind of use them hard. And what I kind of came into Colonel Bearden's work with geometry, resonance geometry in the skies, I kind of thought it was something new. His assertion was that it all began in 1976 with the Russians and the woodpecker grid and so forth. But when I'm looking through older pictures or imagery, we're back to Oklahoma, May of 1960, and the guys are kind of flipped out over this square cloud. And I'm like, well, that's kind of curious. But then I had my own aha moment. I saw my own square cloud, and it was this day that my stomach sank, that I was okay, I don't know about okay, but I was aware of and had accepted that there was manipulation on the scale of hurricanes and some droughts and those kind of things. But this was just an early June afternoon, and I was sitting down at the computer to do a little archiving because I'd gotten a little OCD about capturing images. And I was seeing that there's a geometry in these clouds. First of all, this is what caught my... Hello? So I was seeing this cloud here. And right up to my mouth. So it is. So I was seeing this cloud and the shadow that it cast. But that was not odd enough. My attention was then very quickly drawn to this cutout. And this cutout matched precisely this cloud. And it was at that moment, the square cloud, or the absence thereof, my stomach sank, and my worldview changed. And I had the realization that our weather had been digitized. Like pixels on a screen, the weather was stepped from segment to segment to segment. But I still didn't know where the chemtrails played in this. But I was beginning to see these billows, these very regular shapes, these very regular billows, and then we'd have a gap, and then the direction of the billows would change. We have a right angle or a 45-degree angle, and the billowing would resume at this angle, 2 holes. And the shape of, we'll see at that first image that we're beginning to swing clouds around the holes. We had a cloud here, and I call it a hinge, because off at 90 degrees, we have another fan-shaped set of clouds. And I thought, this is not right. Clouds are supposed to begin on mountaintops. We're supposed to have an orographic effect to these clouds. And that wasn't the case. And in picture after picture after picture, I was seeing that simply wasn't the case. 2 days later, up in Montana, here's Idaho, here's Yellowstone, Wyoming, and this is all Montana, on the 9th of June of '04. This is early afternoon Mountain Time. I see this hole, this literally cut out hole. And I'm like, bloody hell, what's going on? And then these tracks where the fans are coming out. And of course, we have the gridding across, and then we have cross grids. And it was just a continuing confirmation that what we were seeing in the sky was nowhere close to what we were taught in school. This is Iowa. A little bit later, this is '06, and we have the gravity waves, the ripples that have become very, very common, but then there was this underlying much, much, much larger structure in the clouds. This is not normal. And then you've got kind of like a center spine with the ribbing off to the side. How do you forecast this stuff? And that was what my challenge was. And so as I'm digging into this, I'm realizing through Colonel Beard we have scalar energies which deal with time and space and dimensional distortions which can allow access to limitless. HARP and its ability to ionize. Orgon, the accumulation of prana, plus the ability to ionize. Acoustic and VLF waves that came from a scientist from Lockheed Martin, Boyd Bushman. And then the chemtrail program I came to realize was to create enhanced atmospheric conductivity and the ability to measure, mark, and quantify the effects of the above technologies in real time. And then we have to look into something, when we begin to discuss resonance, we have to come to the study of kymatics. These shapes established by a single point source resonating in a medium, whether that medium is water, whether it's clay sand, whether it's talcum powder, we can see kymatics, and we'll see these shapes continually showing up. This is another little video where it'll get a little loud because we're using acoustics or sound waves to excite a solid particle. Let's go ahead and play it.
What we see here is the effect of vibration on a specific substance, lycopodium powder, or spores of the club moss. We have strewn it uniformly on a diaphragm of stretched paper with a diameter of about 30 centimeters, which we now excite by vibration. In this experiment, the frequency, that is to say, the number of vibrations per second, is the same. Now we shall take a closer look at these movements. Here is one of these forms. The material travels inwards from the edge along the bottom of the pile, rises up in the middle, and is then carried back to the periphery. Even if the intensity of the vibration changes, there is still a whole system of radial circulation. At certain frequencies, or with certain tones, an extraordinarily interesting phenomenon is seen. Watch. We see two regularly and continuously rotating areas at either end of a diameter, going round and round like weathercocks. This is the expression of a rotating wave motion. We can see they are rotating in an anti-clockwise direction. We now switch to a different frequency and produce the same phenomenon, but this time in a clockwise direction, because the frequency is different. If we go back to the previous frequency, we have the same phenomenon again in an anti-clockwise direction. Notice that this rotary movement does not affect the circulation or convection in the least.
In the least. And so when we see the change in rotation from one clockwise to counterclockwise, there's an episode of chaos. And I'll show you that in thunderstorms in a minute. But we're going to go to some of the geometry that is showing up inside hurricanes. And we're going to rewind to the summer of 04 and 05, where we had a series of intense thunderstorms, or hurricane seasons. You can see this incredible geometry showing up in the eyes of these storms. And in rotating vortexes, are you supposed to have this connecting structure? Have you ever pulled the plug on a pool of water and seen these shapes show up? I haven't. I haven't. And so how is this possible? This is Hurricane Isabel, 12 September of 03. I see a pentagram. I see a pentagram. And yet it's, you know, it's there. And so there is some resonant geometry, waves that they can establish in the atmosphere to enhance the strength of hurricanes. And it was seeing this geometry, knowing the work of Hans Jenny and kymatics, that I'm seeing this and going, something's up with that. And that summer, those summers were the ones that convinced me that something needed to be said. This was sent by a reader of mine back on January 11 of 08. He took this with a cell phone camera, and he's seeing RF frequencies introduced into the sky. It looks like an antenna of some kind. But all of those clouds, all of that mixture are the powders, the aerosols from these guys. And this was probably the first chemtrail picture I saw that was on Clifford's site. And this one made an impression on me. The engines are not there. And we saw that video in the front of the show of another plane of that make and model delivering the same kind of trail. What I didn't know, at least not until this month, until April of 5, is how the chemtrails played into the weather modification game. I understood the geometry. I knew that was happening. I had seen it and photographed it for about 4 years at this point. But I pulled out some tape from one of my many tapes, and I'll show you kind of like my awakening. Let's go ahead and show this. And then there's a time lapse just immediately after that was my aha.
At this time, I started an open spot right through this disturbance.
It's a windy day. It's a windy day. I've just gotten back from a walk with the dogs. And I always take the camera with. So what I was seeing were these cirrus clouds, and these trails were laid precisely over. I put a little rotating polarizer filter on the camera so I could darken it up.
This is the zone. They're drawn to look at scalar signatures. It's reconnaissance. Plain and simple.
Some trails, some older trails off in the valley distance, and then cloud after cloud having these ticks, these little marks being flown right through them with incredible precision. You know, and I'm not under any busy airways. I was in eastern Idaho. We don't have those kind of flights. We just don't. There's no airports. And so this is later on in the day, Well, actually, yeah, later in the day. And you can see the shield of cloud. There goes the first flight. And then look at the action. So there's some spot that was right there that they were keenly interested in. That was the center point. And all of those flights, those trails displayed a different behavior. And so that was one of my ahas, that these flights are all working in concert to measure some kind of energy or movement of air, if not another energy, in the atmosphere. And then there's different trails. You see this one kind of has an orangish cast to it. This one is very, very blue. Come a little closer. And we're not at a right angle. But what I'm interested in are these powders. This business right here. Found it curious that this plane happened to cross, and he's right there. So this isn't probably another 8 to 10 seconds into the flight, but he crossed this previous trail right where these powders fail to continue to be illuminated, and we're left with just the vortex. So what is happening here that this flight was required to provide a boundary to? There's some energy that ceases at this point. Different trails, blue and these purples. So when we're talking about aluminum and barium and strontium and all of these other trace elements, they're going to look differently, a different color, and have a different spectrum of light that passes through them. And some of them are combined. And I have seen flights, and I've got some pictures where you have one trail that's blue and then one is pink. And this is not going to be a function of the geometry of the angle of sun hitting that trail. It's not, because they're going to be lit uniformly. Yet another example of different colored trails. This was a curious shot. This was shot in Italy in 2005. And again, I'm keen on geometry in the sky. You see the cube tipped on its side with the cirrus kind of being pulled back over it. But then there's this hole. And then the trail right through the center of this. So we're dealing with a geometry in the atmosphere that these trails are keenly interested in measuring and quantifying. There is not a single flight that has flown without a purpose. There is a purpose. And it's so much to do with the atmospheric conditions. Here's a little wave cloud. It is tiny. This was on a drive to New Mexico, and it was a cold January morning. And for some reason, this plane thought it necessary to vector change, at a fairly large degree and pretty quickly too, and off to a new direction once he passed through this cloud. And when you begin to look at the sky, having recognized that there's a geometry that the trails reveal, then you will see them in a different way. This was shot towards sunset. I was in northern Colorado, and this is probably February of 2008. Fresh trail. This is also a relatively fresh trail, but see how it's squished, literally like it's a piece of bread that's been, or a straw that's been stepped on. But over here, very different behavior. And this trail at this precise spot demarks the difference between this squishing and then this behavior. So we're aligning and setting up. In meteorology, we call it fronts. There is a different front, but it is not a cold front or a warm front. It is a different kind of boundary showing up. What happened? I think I hit one of those lower buttons, guys. So what I was going to show you was another trail. And this is, there we go. This one, you can see how it actually turns into a bit of an airfoil, how it's lifted up to the side. And the plane came right through this gap. Right, it's not at the precision, because I would like to have seen it about right here for a little more precision. And it's going to load, and we'll go on to the next one. So this was a kind of a big revelation for me, that we were dealing with this mark, surveil. The data from this goes back into weather computer models, and it all happens very quickly. So they lay the trails out. Here's a mark, and you can see how it literally is just equal with the level of the cloud. The plane is not in ascent or descent through it. It is in level flight with these clouds. And so time after time we see this. So the theory is, and observations tend to borne out, that when we see these gaps in trails, this is another ending of the trail, but this is a fresh plane. There's the plane there. The one up here is probably about right here. I've cropped the picture. But we have a darkening of the trail here. And this flight hit the bottom end of this one and hit the bottom end of this gap. And in time, this opened up a little bit further. All right. So as we begin to, I kind of wish we had trails in the sky today for some morbid reason. And I could take you out and we could do this under the sky. And I could show you in real time what's really going on. Because it is through that process that we begin to learn. And I wish there had been somebody there to kind of show me what was going on in that direction. So I wasn't kind of wandering in the dark, you know, with the program. When the trails begin to form, here's the edge of it. And this little Cessna, little CJ2 jet, hit the very edge of that trail. And that is a data value. That is value that goes into these computer models. This is a series of 3 flights. And I might have a closer one here. Zoom in, here we go. And what I'm interested in is see how this trail bulges here. It's bent back, a pull towards the cirrus, an impression, and it's flight after flight where this trail begin to fail here. We have the cross flight. And this happens in real time. It's almost like the planes are being flown by an artificial intelligence. They're there. And they're programmed, and I'm almost certain there's no pilots on board. Why would you need them? Why would you need them when you've got computers that can fly planes into buildings? Why can't you do this? I mean, clouds are a whole lot safer. You know, fly them into the clouds. And so they're marking the edge of these thunderheads. They set up the direction of thunderstorm movement. They set up the vector, and the resonances come into line, and the clouds follow those paths. And then what we also see is these clouds, because there are particles on board, they impact the ability of the thunderheads to essentially maintain proper droplet production. So as these these particles are put into the cloud, we can have what is called an icing out situation. And when that ice is out, we see the thunderstorm rain droplet production collapse. And as Dane was talking about the other day, all of these dark amorphous clouds without definition show up. And once that happens, the updraft has failed. The rain droplet production has failed. For rain to reach the ground, the drop has to reach a sufficient size for the gravity to grab it and to pull it to the ground. And what we're seeing is that doesn't happen. Some mechanism, some process gets in the way of that happening. And so these trails are, these planes, they're probably mobile transmitters. There's probably a radio frequency or an etheric technology on board, and they resonate these storms to the point where they lose their charge, the transfer of ions, the ability to assemble rain droplets of a proper size. Another shot of the mountain above the house, nice trail. It's not that old, but it marks the precise end of this one perfectly. And this happens every time there's more than 2 trails in the sky. These trails have become older. They've seeded the sky, so we have these wispy cirrus, but it's these zones, these bends, these breaks. And this trail, again, intersects this older one, but again, it fails at that point. A couple of waves. This was an incredible track. And you could see the clouds moving through, but this literally looked like a racetrack pushing up against the mountains. And when you set up a resonance like that, it's like looking at a train track, and you've got this sea of air moving this way. These tracks can come toward you and retard the movement of air, so you get these curls coming over these tracks, these lines. And if you want to accelerate the particle of air farther along, speeding up, you'll see instead of the curves coming this way, they'll go the other way. They'll curl off the other side. And honestly, it takes time-lapse photography for me to figure out what is the direction, what they're actually doing. Another set of trail where we have this augering, where it literally rolls over. But that is data. That is data. Very few of these planes are flown in level flight. They're at angles, up and down. And if we're using these trails as thin wires, then you're sending these pulses of energy, say, down towards the ground. And an atmospheric descending air is warming. Descending air will inhibit the development of thunderstorms. Descending air will break up a snowstorm. And so they can guide these waves to inhibit how a shower or thunderstorm develops. We have this here, and I don't know what causes these anomalies. I have no idea. But the plane was interested enough to fly right through it. Right through it. And precisely so. These were some lenticulars that we're trying to get going over the mountains. Again, on a day with winds at the 18,000 foot level that were under 40 miles an hour. Lenticulars shouldn't show up until we're approaching 100 knots. And so these clouds were forming with wind speeds at a quarter of what should be necessary. And the plane obviously was curious because the cloud was there and it shouldn't be, and so they sent the flight in to investigate or to measure what they were doing. And then the trail tore. It tore. And this is another piece of data for them to figure out how much energy they need to add or detract from the field. Another nice trail, and look at this lift. What's causing this break? There's something there. There's some phenomena happening here. Trail comes along, steps down, come across a much older one, but you can see it's moving. It's like we have the trails used as a graph paper. And we'll get to it. I'm just going to skip onto it because I'm hoping it's coming right up because I want to do questions. It's like you've got a graph paper, and this graph paper is moving. And so they can see by these center points, by these grid lines, how the atmosphere is responding to their energetic input. I was flying off to see Michael Murphy in Hawaii and just leaving Colorado, actually headed up to Denver, and there are these little bits of cirrus up here. And of course, right there, trail, right there, perfect trail. And what I'd really like to see is, where are the pilots? Where are the pilots? They've got the front seat to this ballet in the sky. And very few have shared with me what's going on. I've had some emails from some, and they're sharing, yeah, I see, I didn't believe what you're talking about. And then there's this whole big square shelf cloud, and he knew it was odd. And he was one of the ones that was brave enough to send it along. But when you need to have some kind of a grip, some kind of a hold on the atmosphere, you lay out that kind of a canopy of trails. This is Mexico, Baja, and so forth. And so we have the trails all along the coasts. And so we're to the point where this program is global. It's deep into the Pacific. It's across the entirety of the Atlantic. It's into the South American countries that you can begin to look at Argentine and Chilean and Uruguay. They're all now dealing with trails, and the people down there haven't seen them before. What is this? Is this a comet? Is this Planet X? You know, what are these things? They haven't seen them before. Let's go play this. This is some water vapor imagery, and it's not something I really began looking at until this past winter, and realizing that the trails are a tool being used to attach moisture or sequester moisture. And we can go ahead and play this. There we go. And what I've done is I've just taken my camera, put it up against the computer screen. And this was just not that long ago. This was last weekend. And here we are with Alaska. This is Siberia, the end of the Aleutian chain. And we have some drier air working in here. And look at all these trails layered out. And with this program extending so far out in the Pacific, now it makes sense why California's water supplies are contaminated by this. Why all of the different watersheds in Northern California, independent and without a connection to each other, are showing these particulates. Is because every single drop of rain that falls over this country and probably over this planet now is carrying these particles down to the ground. And so this is extensive. This was worthy of every bit of maybe a dozen to 24 planes flying from Anchorage, from Hawaii. I don't know. Maybe they've got bases in Japan, but they're out there working. This is, we're looking at March. And on the edge of the dry air, this is water vapor imagery. You can see the planes working in as that low pressure system dug into Southern California. Here's another minor low. This is almost of no significance. You can see all the trails there blooming into clouds. And that has all got to be fallout at some point. But what they were doing was engineering that little storm so that in 2 days' time, 4 days' time, 10 days' time is something that they're interested in. Back to last winter over Montana, you can see the visible imagery, the canopy of clouds that has been laid over the Treasure State, the Big Sky State, full of the trails. And so there was a low pressure working in from the west. Actually, there was a low up in here, and it was circulating back around. We go back to water vapor imagery, and you can see the canopy of clouds that they're all creating via these trails. High pressures are very important, and what I've learned is that high pressure systems are very important. So there's a big program, and there are a lot of planes. There are also ships. There are also ships. This picture is of, I believe it's not a Landsat, but a MOSDIS, M-O-S-D-I-S, which is, and this is England, and this is the marine layer. These are not jet contrails. These are trails by ships. So we have a program in the air, and we have a program on the ocean. Who's doing it? That's a really good question. And I really wish somebody that knew precisely would come and say, point some fingers and name some names, because I think we're all ready for this. I think we need to know. And I think as we do our work, and as I said in the movie last night, we're providing cover. And the only way we're going to get this in the public is by awareness. And it's all a function of pointing things out and explaining it sanely. Sanely. That is so key. California, obviously, Nevada, and there were chemtrails with this, but prior to storms, there are weather ships, and they're just constantly tracing out their grids across the ocean, and the trails change shape. And then the follow-on ships come along and investigate these nexuses, these little anomalies. They're very interested. This one came down and decided, oh, maybe not there, let's come back over here. And so there's two fleets. We have two separate but interlinked programs, one in the sky and one on the land. This photograph was shared with me by a reader. He is a train fanatic, enjoys looking at old train pictures. This was shot in Marion, Ohio, and he can date it to March of 1976 because that was the last month that this paint scheme was used. And here we have the trails already in the sky. And that fits because we've got the patents that go back to the early 70s, from about 1969 to 1972. Most of the patents were formed at that point in time. And that allowed, well, or at least provided the intellectual property cover for them to go to work. I was out storm chasing. This is western Kansas in 2006. Nice little thunderhead. It's completely misshapen, but nevertheless, there it is. And we have these cirrus clouds way, way too low. I mean, the top of this is barely on radar. It was barely at 28,000 feet. So if the ground is maybe 2,000 feet at that location, we're looking at cirrus clouds that are 10 to 15,000 feet below where they should be. This is something else that pilots need to start talking about. This should have been a wet afternoon. I mean, the models had us at about a 60–70% chance for rain this afternoon. Thunderstorms went up, looked potential, it looked good, it looked juicy, and then the clouds just turned into this. And they tried to come together at the bottom. They tried to get the updraft going, but it failed. But once this shape, once this diffuse look in the sky shows up, the storm is essentially done. Here's another one, much, much smaller with more blue sky, but this is the healthy growing storm, and this is the one that has been disturbed. Is it disturbed with resonance? Is it disturbed with ionization? Is it disturbed with DOR or dead etheric energy? I don't know. I don't know, but it's happening. It's happening. Here's another one. Same day, the thunderstorms look like they're going to get enough vertical development to where we can get more than just a few sprinkles out of them, but then the planes come along, the trails are laid out, and the storm collapses. Time after time after time, this happens. And this is going to be a time lapse. It's about 1.5 minutes. And let's go ahead and play it. And what we'll see is what should have been a several-inch snowstorm. But what we'll see is literally energy will come in at the bottom, and the storm will be ripped apart, just utterly ripped apart. It cannot maintain a cohesion, an integrity to be able to to generate the crystal size to coalesce the snowflakes to come to the ground. And so we'll watch these clouds at the bottom. They're just stripped apart and see. And you've probably all seen this, but once you begin to compress 6 days worth of cloud movement into 90 seconds, we can see what happens. There's a few snow showers reaching the ground. Blue sky, no planes, at least none with trails. The front tries to come through. It's meeting some powerful resistance, gusty winds with the dust. A little bit of snow off in the distance. We get a few flakes. And the whole event that should have lasted about 15 hours is over in about 15 minutes. That was about all the snow we got. And I have seen through the time lapse, I have seen rain come down to the ground. It almost reaches the ground, and then it's literally pulled back into the cloud, just scooped back up, and the cloud, just scooped back up. And I have seen that. People like to call them UFOs, but there's some energy that's happening here, and these waves are the primary driver. They're the primary driver. These guys are racing along at speeds that are not captured by the radius-on balloons. Weathermen, when we want to sample the upper atmosphere, we either get plane data or we send up balloons. And can't be losing that now, can I? They send up these balloons. And we had an event in Colorado. It was the 2nd of April. We had some 90-mile-an-hour winds coming out of these mountains. And it should have been a snow day. We should have snowed. But there were huge waves coming off those mountains. And from the time lapse, you could do some estimation on the speed of these clouds, and they were every bit of 100 miles an hour northbound. When you look at the radius-on balloon data, it was easterly at 40. And so there's something capturing these clouds that is not represented by the raw meteorological data. It's not happening. It's nice cirrus clouds. This was a crazy day. But you can see that there's some boundary right in through here, all across, where the clouds do a little Z shape. And this should not happen in a fluid. You're going to just soak that in. This was another interesting day where we have a separation right here. See how the clouds were almost like little barrels rolling through with the center seam, and then they turned into waves. You're not going to find that in a textbook. And if you are, I want it. I saw this in Astronomy magazine. Copy and paste. Look at this formation. Look at this puppy. Look at this. I see a complete duplication. And so this is when I said at the beginning that the weather is a program. The weather is a program. And we are seeing, I mean, come on now. I've written Astronomy magazine to see where they sourced the picture, and I haven't heard back yet. But it isn't just California, it isn't just the Pacific. This is something we're dealing with on a global scale. So we have the planes, and there's a lot of them up there. That's Japan Airlines. So we're dealing with almost every single airline participating in this program. So truth comes in 3 stages. First, it's ignored, and it's ridiculed, and finally, it's accepted as self-evident. And we all go through these phases at our own pace. We all come to that truth in our own time. You can't force it on somebody. It doesn't feel right. We call for benevolent and kind leadership. We have to be done with the way things have been done. We've lived through that. It doesn't work. Then the question is, how far forward do we want to progress? Do we want to go a little bit? Do we want to just take the next step? Do we want to take a leap, or do we want to jump into a new paradigm? And this, in my opinion, is our choice. It's your choice. We just have to realize that we have the choice. Because right now we're being shown blue and red and right and left and Democrat and Republican, and none of them are addressing this. And until either of those parties addresses this, or our extraterrestrial issue, or even that we are spiritual beings, they're not worthy of our votes. They're not worthy of our veneration. So we're at that end. We're at that point where we've got to make the decision where we want to take this, because it truly is our choice. And when my worldview changed on that day in June of 2004, and then when I sent my first missive or letter, coming out about this to George Ure, I knew where this would take me. I knew I would lose my job in television. I knew that would happen. I knew that I would remove myself from the mainstream even more than I already had. And I knew the expenses of that. But for me, it was worth it, because I couldn't keep going on. You guys. There will be other weathermen to come out. I can promise you that. I can promise you there will be other weathermen to come out. I've talked with a few. They're there. They recognize it. They just need their paycheck. I get that. I haven't had a paycheck since 2005. I know what that's like. So I understand. But there's a point where enough is enough, where you have to have some courage to speak what you see, to speak your truth. And we're not all the same for a reason. We're all different to add spice to this experience. And it is in that difference, it is in that diversity where we're going to find our strength. And it has been incredibly heartwarming, encouraging, and exciting to see the people here this weekend. That we all come from this from different paths. And with that, we bring our own wisdom. We bring our own strengths. And when we come together to accomplish this, then they have no choice but to acknowledge it, and eventually I suppose that they'll admit it. But we have the strength. This is our future. This is our planet. And it's time for us to take it back.